Heat and power from the sun. Petroleum, natural gas, coal. The quantities of these fossil fuels available on the earth are finite. No one can dispute the fact that if consumption of fossil fuels continues, they will eventually be depleted. Equally certain is the fact that these fuels are not being replaced by any known natural processes at any significant rate. Now, for purposes of this discussion, we shall omit wood and other renewable biomass fuels. We'll deal with those at a later time. Also, it is certain that the demand for power will continue to increase worldwide as the population increases. Nuclear energy, once thought to be the answer to the future world's energy requirements, has proved to be disappointing. Recent failures of nuclear power facilities such as Chernobyl or Fukushima have clearly demonstrated the short and long-term dangers of conventional atomic power. The health and other problems associated with this means of power production are indeed long-term, spanning generations. The accumulation of nuclear waste is a problem which has never been solved, and the background radiation count continues to rise worldwide. The ideal solution to the world's impending energy crisis would be to simply reduce world population. By this, I do not mean the extermination of people, not at all. All that is required is simply to reduce the birth rate. In other words, simply use a little common sense and stop having so many kids. Well, whether or not this is likely to happen on a worldwide scale remains to be seen. But even if it were to happen, we would still face a dwindling supply of conventional fuel reserves. The chemical uses for coal and petroleum-related products are almost infinite. The very lowest use for them is fuel. Why waste this precious storehouse of raw material when another, literally limitless fuel source is available? Power from the sun. And that is our subject for today. The sun, as most of you know, is a continuing thermonuclear reaction situated at a very convenient 93 million miles from Earth. The sun's radiant energy reaches the Earth at exactly the right angles to produce the seasons and the variations in climate which we enjoy. Now, this has been going on for a very, very long time and is predicted to continue for millions of years into the future. For purposes of our discussion, endlessly. Even a small fraction of the solar energy which reaches us is sufficient to supply the entire world's energy requirements. Totally pollution-free. Now, contrary to the propaganda currently published and broadcast in the controlled media, solar energy is not a new thing, and it does not require more years of research and development before it can be put to practical use. It has been in use for many, many hundreds of years and can be employed anywhere on Earth where the sun shines. Let's consider two ways of utilizing the sun's generous energy to our benefit. First, we can use it to heat our homes in winter. Second, we can use it to produce power, to run the power-hungry machines deemed indispensable to a modern civilization. The very first use of solar energy was for heating. Well, that's easy enough to realize. Just walk outside on a hot summer day. You got it. In fact, we all get it. In summer, that is. But what about heat in the winter when you need it? Well, believe it or not, hundreds of years before you and I were born, people around the world were utilizing the sun to stay warm in winter. Come back with me now to ancient Greece, 2,500 years ago. The Greek philosopher Socrates had it all figured out. He said, the ideal house should be cool in summer and warm in winter. Well, we can all agree with Socrates on that point. But the question is, how do we accomplish this? In Greece, summers were scorching and winters were mild. Wood, in the form of charcoal, was used as the fuel of choice for heating and cooking. It was burned in portable braziers, which were, by the way, completely inadequate for keeping the Greeks cozy and warm in the winter. The great demand for wood charcoal resulted in the decimation of forests near populated areas, and charcoal was shipped in from considerable distances. Fuel prices were high. Fortunately for the Greeks, an alternative source of energy was available: the sun. They learned to design and place their buildings to avoid the direct heat of the summer sun and yet to capture it in the winter. Clever, huh? This was the birth of solar architecture. The Greeks had long been keenly aware of the sun's movements across the sky. They kept time with sundials, the most common of which was the gnomon. The gnomon was simply a straight post similar to a flagpole. Like a flagpole, the gnomon was fixed perpendicular to the ground. In other words, it was a post stuck in a hole in the ground. That was it. Well, from the ever-changing shadow which it cast upon the ground, the Greeks could determine the day, the hour, and the season. And it never needed batteries. The Greeks understood the basic apparent motion of the sun across the sky, that in winter it travels in a low arc across the southern sky, and that in summer it travels high overhead. It was this simple and very basic understanding that made it possible for them to design houses that were comparatively cool in summer and yet utilized the sun to warm them in winter. The Greeks positioned their homes so that the winter sunlight could easily enter the house through a south-facing portico. You may think of it as a covered porch. The masonry walls and floors soaked up the heat during daytime and continued to radiate it into the rooms even after sunset. The north side, as a rule, did not contain windows or doors, and the walls were made of adobe blocks about 1.5 feet thick to reduce the chilling effect of winter north winds. Overhanging roofs and eaves shaded the rooms of the house from the high sun during most of the day during summer. The same principle has been applied many other times throughout history. If you're old enough, you may remember some of the old farmhouses in the South and Southwest, which were built with long covered porches across their south-facing fronts. The Greeks did not know how to produce sheets of clear glass, so all windows were open. I'm unfamiliar with the extent of their use of wood for doors and shutters. This would be a good topic for you to research for yourself. But even with these most basic facts in mind, it should be easy for us to visualize a dwelling which would utilize the sun for winter heating and at the same time not roast us in the summer. It should incorporate the following basic features. First, our hypothetical dwelling should face south. Second, it should have sheltered openings on the south side to admit heat from the low winter sun. Third, it should utilize overhanging eaves to shield us from the hot summer sun, which would come from directly overhead. And fourth, The north end should have a minimum of openings, ideally none, and should be very well insulated against cold winter winds. Ideally, the construction material itself should be the insulator. Now, bear in mind that what I have given you is just a tiny glimpse of the solar architecture of over 2,500 years ago. The Greeks had no modern insulating materials, no plate glass to keep out wind and concentrate heat, no elaborate piping systems, no electrically driven blowers or fans for air circulation. In a future program, I will describe some of the very efficient solar heated homes of recent times. I think you will be amazed. But how well did this primitive Greek solar architecture work? Well, according to reports surviving from the time, quite well. And empirical evidence of recent times seems to confirm this. For example, architect Edwin D. Thatcher studied the solar heating capability of rooms facing south in a climate similar to that of ancient Greece. He found that a naked person sitting in the sunny part of such a room should remain comfortable almost 70% of the time during the colder months of November through March. And the Greeks weren't the only ones to utilize the concept of solar heating. The Pueblo dwellers of the American Southwest, the Romans, and even the Victorian English took advantage of it. The ancient Romans and the Victorians had several great advantages over the ancient Greeks, not the least of which was the availability of large sheets of plate glass. Beginning with the 1st century A.D., almost all Roman bathhouses were oriented facing south to capture the heat of the winter sun. In addition, the entire southern wall of most Roman baths was glazed. As you probably know, public bathing was a really big thing in ancient Rome, even though they didn't use soap. One of the largest Roman baths was that of Caracalla, which held as many as 2,000 people at a time. That's 2,000. Seneca described a typical afternoon in the bath like this. Picture to yourself the assortment of sounds which are strange enough to make me hate my very powers of hearing. When your strenuous gentleman, for example, is exercising himself by flourishing leaden weights. When he is working hard, or else pretends to be working hard, I can hear him grunt. And whenever he releases his imprisoned breath, I can hear him panting in wheezy and high-pitched tones. Or perhaps I notice some lazy fellow, content with a cheap rub-down, and the crack of the pummeling hand on his shoulder varies in sound as the hand is laid on flat or hollow. And add to this the arresting of an occasional pickpocket, the racket of the man who always likes to hear his own voice in the bath, or the enthusiast who plunges into the swimming pool with unconscionable noise and splashing. Then the cake seller, with his different cries, the sausage man, the confectioner, and all the vendors of food hawking their wares, each with his own different intonation. Sounds like an interesting place to me. And so we leave you in a Roman bath over 2,000 years ago. Have fun. This has been Solar Energy Part 1, and we invite you to join us for Solar Energy Part 2. We thank you for being with us, and we invite you once again to write for your free copy of the hour-long CD entitled, Does God Exist? This is a story unlike anything you have ever heard before, and it can be yours absolutely free of charge. All you have to do is just ask for it. Just send an email to bobbymoorespeaks@gmail.com. That's all the address you need, bobbymoorespeaks@gmail.com. And your copy of Does God Exist will be sent to you as quickly as possible and as long as supplies last, absolutely free of charge. And so until next time, this is Bobby D. Moore saying goodbye, friends.